One nation, 50 years, 200,000 dead. And somehow we call it progress. Between 1850 and 1900, the American West consumed lives the way a furnace consumes coal. Native Americans watched their world dissolve. Settlers buried children beside wagon trails. Outlaws died young and became eternal. And from this chaos, from this blood-soaked soil, rose the mythology that would define what it means to be American. You think you know this story. You have seen the cowboy hats and the saloon doors. You have heard the crack of a six-shooter in 100 films. But the reality beneath the legend is darker, stranger, and more human than any screenplay ever written. This is not ancient history. This is the origin story of American violence, American opportunity, and American contradiction. This is the truth Hollywood tried to bury under tumbleweeds and triumphant music. The year is 1803. President Thomas Jefferson completes what may be the greatest real estate transaction in human history. For $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, the United States purchases 828,000 square miles from Napoleon Bonaparte. The Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the young nation overnight. Suddenly, there is a West worth dreaming about. But what Jefferson bought was not empty land. It was home to hundreds of indigenous nations, each with languages, governments, spiritual traditions, and territorial boundaries older than European memory. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche, the Crow, the Nez Perce, the Pawnee. They did not know it yet, but Jefferson's signature had written their obituary. Before we venture into the storm, understand the world that existed at the edge of the Mississippi River in the 1840s. The American East had cities, factories, banks, and newspapers. It had crowded tenements where Irish immigrants dreamed of something more. It had southern plantations built on the broken backs of enslaved people. It had ambition pressing against its borders like steam against a boiler. And beyond the river, what did Americans see? They saw infinity. They saw grasslands that stretched to the horizon without a single fence. They saw mountains that touched the sky. They saw resources waiting to be extracted, land waiting to be claimed, destiny waiting to be manifest. Manifest, destiny. Two words that would justify genocide, celebrate expansion, and transform a nation's greed into a nation's religion. The phrase appeared in 1845, coined by journalist John O'Sullivan, who declared it America's divine right to spread democracy and capitalism from sea to shining sea. God wanted this, the argument went. Who were the indigenous peoples to stand in God's way? If you were living in a cramped eastern city in 1848, what would you have done when word arrived that gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill in California? Would you have stayed in your factory job earning pennies, breathing coal dust, watching your children grow pale? Or would you have believed the rumors? Would you have sold everything you owned for a wagon, a mule, and a dream? 300,000 people made that choice. They called themselves 49ers, and they transformed California from a sleepy Mexican territory into an American obsession almost overnight. San Francisco went from a village of 200 to a city of 25,000 in 2 years. Ships arrived in the harbor and were abandoned where they anchored because their crews had vanished into the gold fields. The mathematics of the gold rush were brutal and honest. A few men struck it rich. Most found only exhaustion, disease, and disappointment. The real fortunes were made not by miners but by the merchants who sold them shovels, the saloon keepers who sold them whiskey, the brothel owners who sold them comfort. Levi Strauss did not dig for gold. He sold durable pants to the men who did. He died wealthy. Most of his customers died forgotten. The gold rush established the template for Western expansion. Promise everything. Deliver tragedy to the majority. Celebrate the exceptions as proof that the dream was real. Now, trace the routes west. Before the railroad, crossing the continent meant walking. It meant the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Santa Fe Trail. These were not roads. They were suggestions scratched into the earth by previous travelers, marked by the graves of those who did not finish the journey. The overland passage took 4 to 6 months. Families traveled in covered wagons that offered no protection from rain, dust, or despair. They carried everything they owned and discovered it was still not enough. Cholera killed more emigrants than any other cause. The disease moved through wagon trains like fire through dry grass, striking in the morning and killing by nightfall. Victims were buried quickly in shallow graves, often in the middle of the trail itself, so that subsequent wagons would pack down the earth and discourage wolves from digging. Children watched their parents die. Parents watched their children die. Survivors kept walking because there was nothing behind them worth returning to. Along these trails, travelers encountered indigenous peoples in various states of alliance and conflict. Some tribes traded with the emigrants, exchanging food and horses for manufactured goods. Others, understanding what the endless stream of wagons meant for their future, chose resistance. Neither approach would save them from what was coming. Consider the Comanche. At their peak, they controlled a territory larger than France, dominating the southern plains with a cavalry tradition that European military observers considered superior to anything in the Old World. Comanche warriors could fire arrows with lethal accuracy while hanging off the side of a galloping horse, a feat that took years of training and natural talent few possessed. The Comanche had stopped Spanish expansion cold. They had held Mexican armies at bay for generations. They believed they could do the same to the Americans. They were wrong, not because they were inferior warriors, but because they faced an enemy that fought with microbes as well as bullets. Smallpox, cholera, measles, diseases against which indigenous peoples had no immunity devastated populations that bullets alone could not have conquered. The Comanche numbered perhaps 40,000 in 1840. By 1875, barely 1,500 remained. This pattern repeated across the West. The invisible army of European disease marched ahead of every cavalry column, every wagon train, every railroad crew. It killed more Native Americans than all the wars combined. And those who survived the plagues faced a military force that had just finished fighting the deadliest war in American history. The Civil War ended in 1865. It left behind an army equipped with repeating rifles, experienced in industrial scale killing, and led by generals who had learned their trade burning southern cities to the ground. This army turned west. The next 25 years witnessed a series of conflicts collectively called the Indian Wars, though that name sanitizes what actually occurred. These were campaigns of extermination dressed in the language of pacification. The goal was not to defeat indigenous military forces, but to destroy the foundation of indigenous life itself. General Philip Sheridan understood this. He ordered the slaughter of the buffalo herds that sustained the Plains tribes. Professional hunters killed millions of animals, taking only the hides and leaving mountains of rotting carcasses across the prairie. A single hunter could kill over 100 buffalo in a day with a long-range rifle, never giving the herd time to flee. By 1883, the buffalo was functionally extinct. 20 years earlier, an estimated 30 million animals had darkened the plains. Without buffalo, the nomadic lifestyle was impossible. Tribes that had roamed freely for centuries were forced onto reservations, confined to the least valuable land the government could find, dependent on federal supplies that arrived late, spoiled, or not at all. Resistance continued. At Little Bighorn in 1876, a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors annihilated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry. The American public reacted with fury. Custer became a martyr. The tribes that defeated him became targets of concentrated vengeance. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered and was murdered in custody. The great chiefs who had won the most significant indigenous military victory of the era found that victory meant nothing against an enemy with unlimited reinforcements and no moral limits. The final chapter came at Wounded Knee in 1890. The 7th Cavalry, the same regiment Custer had led to destruction, opened fire on a band of Lakota who were in the process of surrendering. Between 200 and 300 people died, most of them women and children. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their participation in the massacre. Wounded Knee marked the end of armed indigenous resistance. It did not mark the end of indigenous survival, adaptation, and eventual resurgence. But that is a story the Western myth rarely tells. Now shift your attention to the Iron Horse. If disease was the invisible weapon that conquered the West, the railroad was the visible one. It transformed distance from a barrier into a mere inconvenience. It made the West economically viable. It sealed the fate of every culture and ecosystem that stood in its path. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. A golden spike connected the Central Pacific Line from California with the Union Pacific Line from the east. Photographs captured dignified men in formal attire, celebrating what the newspapers called the wedding of the rails. The photographs did not show the workers who made it possible. Chinese laborers built the Central Pacific through the Sierra Nevada, working in conditions so dangerous that no one bothered to count the dead. They tunneled through granite using hand tools and black powder. They dangled from cliffs in wicker baskets to plant explosives. They died in avalanches, in premature detonations, in accidents that went unreported because Chinese lives were not considered worth documenting. Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and formerly enslaved men built the Union Pacific across the plains. They worked for low wages, lived in mobile tent cities, and faced attacks from indigenous defenders who understood exactly what the railroad meant. The railroad companies received enormous land grants from the federal government, not just rights of way, but alternating sections of land extending miles on either side of the tracks. They sold this land to settlers, creating customers for their freight services and permanent communities along their routes. The government in turn got a West that was accessible, controllable, and taxable. Small farming families who bought railroad land found themselves trapped in an economic system designed to extract their labor. They were too far from markets to sell without the railroad. The railroad charged whatever rates it chose. Farmers went into debt. Banks foreclosed. The land changed hands, consolidating into larger and larger holdings. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system working as intended. The cattle industry rose and fell within a single generation. The great cattle drives, those iconic images of cowboys pushing thousands of longhorns north from Texas to Kansas railheads, lasted barely 20 years. They began after the Civil War, when Texas ranchers discovered that cattle worth $4 a head in San Antonio could fetch $40 in Chicago. The drives ended in the late 1880s, killed by barbed wire, railroad expansion, and a series of catastrophic winters that froze millions of animals on the open range. During those 20 years, Cowboys became the central figures of Western mythology. The reality was less romantic than the legend. Cowboys were laborers. They worked for wages that rarely exceeded $1 a day. They spent months in the saddle, ate badly, slept on the ground, and aged quickly. A significant percentage were black or Mexican, a fact that the white mythology systematically erased. The job was dangerous. Stampedes killed men. Rivers drowned them. Horses threw them. Diseases infected them. And at the end of the drive, after months of hardship, they received a few dollars and a chance to spend it all in a single weekend in a cattle town before starting the process again. Would you trade your current life for that existence? Would you trade climate control and medical care and the reasonable expectation of reaching old age for the freedom of the open range? The myth says you would. The reality suggests the myth is lying. Cattle towns. Abilene. Dodge City. Tombstone. These names echo with gunfire in the American imagination. The reality was simultaneously more mundane and more sordid than the movies suggest. These towns existed to separate cowboys from their money as efficiently as possible. Saloons, gambling halls, brothels. They operated around the clock during drive season, and they generated enormous profits for their owners. The violence was real, but concentrated. Most residents of these towns lived ordinary lives, running shops and raising families. The gunfights happened, but they were not daily occurrences. They were notable precisely because they were unusual. Wyatt Earp was a real person who participated in the real gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona Territory in 1881. He was also a gambler, a pimp, a con man, and an enforcer for various business interests throughout his long and complicated career. He died in 1929 at the age of 80, having spent his final years consulting on Hollywood westerns that transformed him into a noble lawman. Wild Bill Hickok was a real scout, a real gunfighter, and a real marshal. He killed perhaps 10 men in documented incidents, not the hundreds attributed to him by dime novels. He was shot in the back of the head while playing poker in Deadwood in 1876, holding what became known as the dead man's hand, aces and eights. Jesse James was a real outlaw who robbed banks and trains across the Midwest for 16 years. He was also a Confederate guerrilla who had participated in some of the worst atrocities of the Civil War, including the Centralia Massacre, where his unit murdered 22 unarmed Union soldiers after forcing them to strip naked. The newspapers that celebrated him as a Robin Hood figure neglected to mention these details. Billy the Kid killed perhaps 4 men personally, far fewer than the 21 suggested by legend. He was shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881 at the age of 21, though even his age is disputed. In death, he became eternal, the subject of more books, films, and songs than figures who lived longer and accomplished more. Why do we remember these men? Why do their names outlast those of scientists, artists, and reformers from the same era? Because they represent something Americans want to believe about themselves. They suggest that individual will can triumph over institutional power. They suggest that violence solves problems. They suggest that rules are for other people. These are comforting lies. The West was not won by individuals. It was won by railroads, by corporate interests, by military campaigns funded by Eastern banks and executed by soldiers following orders. The outlaws were footnotes. The system rolled over them, the same way it rolled over everyone else who stood in its path. But footnotes make better stories than systems. So we remember the footnote. The frontier closed. In 1890, the same year as Wounded Knee, the Census Bureau announced that a continuous line of settlement could no longer be identified. The West was full. The emptiness that had defined it was gone. 3 years later, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a paper arguing that the frontier had shaped American character. The struggle against wilderness had made Americans democratic, individualistic, and practical. Without a frontier to tame, Turner worried, what would Americans become? Turner's thesis was influential and wrong. It ignored indigenous peoples entirely, treating the West as empty space rather than occupied territory. It celebrated virtues that were actually vices dressed in patriotic language. It provided intellectual justification for American imperialism that would soon extend beyond the continental boundaries. But Turner captured something real about American self-perception. Americans believed they were a frontier people even after the frontier was gone. They transferred frontier mythology to new contexts. The business titan was a pioneer. The immigrant was a pioneer. Eventually, the astronaut was a pioneer. The language of westward expansion became the language of every American endeavor. The West that emerged from the frontier period looked nothing like the West that preceded it. Native nations confined to reservations faced assimilation policies designed to destroy their cultures. Children were removed from families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their tradition. The explicit goal, articulated by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, was to kill the Indian and save the man. Small ranchers and farmers struggled against corporations that controlled water, transportation, and markets. The populist movement of the 1890s represented their fury, a political insurgency that demanded government regulation of railroads, free coinage of silver to inflate the currency and reduce debt, and direct election of senators. The movement failed in its immediate goals, but planted seeds that progressive reformers would harvest in the following decades. Mining companies extracted wealth from Western landscapes, leaving behind scarred earth and polluted water. Timber companies cleared forests. Irrigation projects redirected rivers. The transformation was total and intentional. The West was remade in the image of Eastern capital, and yet the mythology grew. Buffalo Bill Cody, a genuine frontier scout and buffalo hunter, created the Wild West show in 1883 and spent the next 3 decades performing a sanitized version of Western history for audiences across America and Europe. Sitting Bull himself appeared briefly in the show, earning $50 a week to play the role of the savage enemy. The same man who had led the resistance at Little Bighorn became an employee of the entertainment industry that was transforming his tragedy into spectacle. When film emerged as a medium, the Western became its founding genre. The Great Train Robbery in 1903 established the template. By the 1920s, Hollywood was producing hundreds of Westerns annually. The cowboys were white. The Indians were villains. The violence was righteous. The conquest was justified. These films taught generations of Americans a version of history that served particular ideological purposes. They taught that violence was necessary for civilization. They taught that white men were natural leaders. They taught that indigenous peoples were obstacles rather than victims. They taught that women were rewards for male heroism. They taught that the past was simple, even when the present felt complicated. The Western declined in the late 20th century as audiences became uncomfortable with its assumptions. Revisionist films like Little Big Man, Unforgiven, and Dances with Wolves attempted to complicate the mythology. Television series offered more nuanced portrayals. Indigenous filmmakers began telling their own stories. But the original mythology persists. It shapes political rhetoric about immigration, about land use, about guns, about the relationship between individuals and government. When Americans argue about the Second Amendment, they are arguing in language that the frontier period established. When Americans debate environmental protection, they face assumptions about resource extraction that Western expansion normalized. When Americans confront their racial history, they must reckon with what happened between the Mississippi and the Pacific. You have spent the last several minutes in the company of ghosts. Trail riders who never reached Oregon. Warriors who defended their homes against impossible odds. Immigrants who built railroads and received neither credit nor compensation. Cowboys who died young and poor despite what the songs claimed. Women whose names never appeared in the histories written by men. Children who grew up in a world their grandparents would not have recognized. These ghosts have something to tell you. They say that progress is not neutral. They say that someone always pays for expansion. They say that myths are not innocent. They say that the stories we tell about the past shape the futures we are willing to accept. The Wild West lasted 50 years. Its mythology has lasted 150 and counting. The question is not whether the mythology will endure. It will. The question is whether we can hold the mythology and the reality in the same consciousness without flinching. Whether we can admire the courage while condemning the conquest. Whether we can understand why the myth appeals to us while refusing to let it absolve us. Does this feel like ancient history? Or does it feel like the foundation beneath your feet, still settling, still capable of shifting? The frontier never closed. It just moved into cities, into digital spaces, into the territories of other nations. Wherever Americans go, they carry the assumptions the West implanted. They carry the belief that empty space exists for filling. They carry the faith that violence can be redemptive. They carry the conviction that their expansion is destiny rather than choice. This is the inheritance. This is the truth beneath the legend. This is the history that made the present and will shape the future whether we acknowledge it or not. The Wild West is not over. It just changed costumes. The next time you see a Western, the next time you encounter the imagery of cowboys and Indians, of frontier towns and open ranges, remember what you have learned here. Remember the cost. Remember who paid it. Remember that every myth conceals as much as it reveals. And ask yourself what myths you are living inside right now. What future generations will uncover beneath the stories you tell yourself about your own time. History is not dead. History is not even past. History is the ghost that walks beside you, whispering in a voice you have learned to mistake for silence. Listen, the West is still speaking. This has been the entire history of the Wild West. I'm grateful you chose to spend this time confronting the complicated, heartbreaking, and essential story of how the American nation stretched itself across a continent. History lives because people remember it, because people like you refuse to accept easy answers and comfortable simplifications. Carry these stories forward. Let them trouble you productively. Let them make you a more thoughtful citizen of a country that is still becoming whatever it will be. Until we meet again in the past, take care of the present. Final image, visual echo of Script's resilience theme.